Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. So far, we've looked at the first two installments in the Mega Man X series. While Mega Man X1 is the Super Nintendo classic almost everybody's played, being the most financially successful and well received, I personally think Mega Man X2 is the superior game. To me, it seemed to be a smoother, better crafted experience, mainly because it isn't as arbitrarily difficult as its predecessor, though the music isn't nearly as memorable and the weapons are disappointing. That said, while X2 didn't get the same amount of loving attention as X1, it performed well enough for Capcom to start developing the third title. So after another 12 months, Mega Man X3 was released for the Super Nintendo on December 1st, 1995. Unfortunately, press reception was noticeably less favorable this time. Some critics gave X3 a positive review, praising it as a solid send-off for the 16-bit era, but others had grown tired of the formula, complaining it's the same game yet again, or even noted sluggish and sloppy design overall. Now, because the Super Nintendo was slowly but surely losing popularity with the then recent rise of 5th generation consoles, ports of the game for the Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn, boasting anime-esque FMV cutscenes and a rearranged Red Book audio soundtrack, came out on April 26, 1996. For whatever reason, these two versions never hit store shelves in the United States, however, only in Japan and Europe. Regardless of such, they got even more flack than the original, with one source calling Mega Man X3 the worst Saturn title out there. Damn, that's a bold statement. Even fans of the franchise generally consider this swan-song of the SNES trilogy not necessarily a bad game, but inferior to the previous installments from what I've gathered. Interesting. Could it be that Capcom was losing it already with the third X game? Normally, I would go into the plot at this point, but you know, it's really just rehashed Wikipedia or in-game stuff in every video. Unless the game is pretty story-driven or has some sort of intricate narrative that really adds to the overall experience, then I don't feel the need to bring attention to these elements anymore. So skipping the story, we're going to jump into the gameplay itself and find out where it supposedly falls apart. We all know how the Mega Man X games work at this point. You shoot shit, you dash, you wall jump, you kill 8 Mavericks in the desired order, and then you go through 3 last stages to reach the final boss. The controls are spot on, you can dash the second you begin the game, yada yada yada. On to the first topic of discussion, the new weapons. I can safely say they're the best yet. With 1 or 2 exceptions, all of them have been very helpful. In addition to the enemies and bosses having weaknesses and resistances to a certain gun like always, your weapons here have very distinct fire properties that make them the better options over others depending on the stage layout and type of opposition you're dealing with. For instance, if you find yourself in a tight spot or can't think of a way to safely progress, fully charging the Triad Thunder will blow up all enemies on screen, which of course leaves you vulnerable in the charge up period, while the Ray Splasher fires a quick volley of 7 bullets in a spread formation, handy in cases you just want to take down threats you can't quite reach with a regular X-Buster. The capability of the acid burst to bounce off of surfaces and leave residue has proven to be useful. The parasitic bomb is great for immediately paralyzing an incoming enemy and even have it crash into another nearby threat. Just a lot of stuff like this. The only weapon I found somewhat overpowered was the spinning blade. 2 spinning blades that travel a short distance forward and then backwards in an arc. The supposed downside is that it's hard to aim, but in close range combat, the 2 blades hit the target before they can even manage to split. As such, this firearm deals big damage and is probably the one I got the most benefit out of, but it's not as broken as the Storm Tornado in X1, that's most important. I'm also glad the X-Buster wasn't my primary choice like in X2, where I largely only used the special weapons for the appropriate Maverick, so that's a good sign. I honestly had a lot of fun toying around with the selection in X3, which is one of Mega Man's biggest strengths, and it makes for increased lasting appeal. Also increasing the lasting appeal of X3 are the optional upgrades you can find in the 8 main stages. I mean, this is an X game after all, not a classic Mega Man game. Returning are the 8 heart containers, 4 refillable sub-tanks, and 4 armor upgrades, but this time around, however, you can also find 4 enhancement chips and 4 ride armor modules. The former are like further expansions of a specific body part. Take the leg armor, which allows you to air dash both horizontally and vertically in X3, and if you manage to locate the leg chip on top of that, you can perform double air dashes. In order to obtain an enhancement chip, you need to first of all have the corresponding armor upgrade beforehand, and secondly, not have another chip already installed. I actually like this concept, and it would be completely fine by me if the decision you make wasn't permanent. As far as I know, there is no way to swap out your currently equipped chip for another one. This is downright mean. I cannot know in advance what the other chips bring to the table, so I have to pass up all the offers until I've run across all 4 and then make a decision? Why, man? Why? Sure, now I know what all the chips do, and now I am aware of the fact you can't switch them, but this just ruined the system for me. As for the ride armor modules, remember those mobile suit armors you occasionally run into in Mega Man X1 and X2? Well, in X3, assuming you possess their modules, you can summon them at will at these special ride armor platforms found in each stage. There are 4 ride armors to select from, and each behave differently. The main differences are in their attacks, but the frog armor is the only one to not short out when underwater, for instance. Pretty cool that these battle machines are now part of your own arsenal, even though you're restricted to using them in specific sections of a level. What's easily Mega Man X3's most defining feature, however, is the ability to play as Zero. That's right, if you pause the game and flip the menu tab using the shoulder buttons, you can call Zero to take over the mission for X. Now this guy is powerful, dude. He handles very similarly to X without any upgrades, and even though there are no extra guns or health and armor upgrades for him to obtain at all, his energy bar is very long from the start, and he has this awesome saber you can use after releasing a fully charged shot. I'm pretty sure it one-hit KOs nearly every regular enemy you come across. Zero is quite fun to play as for it. His addition is a great one, but I'm glad his usefulness is limited somewhat as to not be game-breaking. You cannot fight any bosses as him, be they small or big. X will automatically intervene, and Zero can only be called once per stage. Every level has at least one mini-boss room, so you'll always have to do parts of stages as X. Even then, dying only once as Zero disables him for your entire playthrough. That's kind of a cruel punishment, honestly, and you lose all your shots at the game's good ending immediately. In my opinion, the good ending isn't worth a ton, though at least more than an X2, but that's still bizarre and a dick move from Capcom. This decision really starts rearing its ugly head after learning the stages suffer from this can't tell what the hell's coming up syndrome. The camera doesn't always seem to be in the right place for you to see what's awaiting you further above or below, meaning you'll just have to trust the game it doesn't take a cheap shot in these instances. Generally speaking, that's the case, but be prepared to ram headfirst into foes or enemy fire every now and then, or worse, a bed of insta-kill spikes. The level design feels pretty sloppy in terms of visibility. It ain't no match for the classic Sonic games, but it's still pretty annoying, especially so as Zero. Another problem I noticed with X3 stages is that I found myself walking empty stretches from time to time. This wasn't present in X1 or X2, and I'm not sure if it was intentional or because of time constraints, but I'm assuming the latter, seeing how some of the level designs were outsourced to third-party developer Minakuchi Engineer, responsible for the Mega Man titles on the original Game Boy. Either way, the stages felt a bit padded out and longer as a result. I do believe the levels are legitimately longer than in the preceding titles though, so not merely because of the empty stretches, and the greater length is not something that bugged me. I mean, neither did it in Sonic Heroes, and that game's levels are longer still. In fact, I kinda liked the length in X3. In the 2 previous installments, it could seem as if those stages whizzed by, but not this time around, and by good fortune, that's not the only positive I see in the level design. Ignoring of course the visibility issue, it's mainly the enemy placement and the enemies in and of themselves that I got a nice kick out of. The stages are often laid out in such a way that you cannot blindly rush in and get through scratch-free from enemy fire, and the AI overall has been improved. A selection of the foes now have defense mechanisms or counterattacks. Wall blasters, for example, bend down to the floor the moment X pulls the trigger on a weapon, making it harder to hit the thing, and Drill Mole W, if that's his name, blocks shots by firing harmful drills at X. Patience and observation and taking the right approach are the key to making it in one piece in X3, and it likely plays a big role in why many of the various weapons are as valuable as they are, which we discussed before. There aren't as many platforming hazards and challenges as in X2, and while I gave the first installment flack for being tame with regards to that, it's not something that hinders the game I'm currently reviewing in my opinion. X1 stages are too easy overall, and their lack of platforming isn't very balanced out by more sophisticated running and gunning as far as I'm concerned. X3 stages are, and it makes all the difference. Look, they aren't perfect with the mentioned downsides, and this is going to be a very subjective statement, but I found the level design in X3 the most entertaining of the whole SNES trilogy, except the locations of all the items and upgrades. In that aspect, I think X3 is probably the least remarkable. Besides the secret areas not being notably tricky to discover, there's so much stuff that you can blatantly see but not reach because you don't have the needed accessory. I didn't appreciate that in X1, and I don't appreciate it here. Again, I think it adds to the game when this is done in moderation, increasing replay value and all that, but depending on your personal taste, this could be a means of flashing out your adventure more, or it could be a tiring game of back and forth for the sake of standing a chance when tackling the last set of stages. I'm somewhere in the middle. I enjoy that drive of growing stronger and find fully completing games an addicting process, but that's not to say it wasn't needlessly tedious in X3. While I do like how some of these mysteries have multiple solutions to them, even though not to the same degree as before, a couple of them are plain rubbish. Plain rubbish. I see these crates in Gravity Beetle's stage, blocking access to a heart container. I try everything imaginable, but nothing happens. Turns out you're supposed to clear a certain level first, which then causes the crates to be gone. Not very fulfilling design if you ask me. You do get a radar of sorts like in X2, but since the majority of this shit is either tucked away in obvious places or simply not obtainable by default, its helpfulness only goes so far. It's a bit of a pain to use anyway. You get this overview of the structure of the stage in grids that marks the remaining collectibles when entering the level, but you cannot get it back after that. You'd have to have a photographic memory to memorize it or take a picture, which is funnily enough what I ended up doing, but what's wrong with a simple option to pop it back on screen? To be fair, you get this awesome checklist of items when highlighting a stage, which aids significantly in keeping track of what you found and what you're still missing. This actually makes the radar rather cool. Now, remember that side quest in X2 where you take down the X-Hunters to achieve the good ending? X3 has something similar. After destroying your second Maverick, Dr. Doppler sends out Bit, Bite, and Vile Mark II. Yeah, that asshole's back as well. However, you don't run into these guys in the same way, and it doesn't alter the ending. Rather, it can replace a couple of the bosses you fight in the final set of stages. So, how do you run into these guys? Well, you may notice in the 8 main stages that you enter a room that's completely empty with nothing in it. Reason being, these chambers hold the battles with Bit and Bite, when they happen to be in the same stage as you. It's not indicated or whatever where they're currently at, so it's random whenever you encounter them. This can be frustrating because these guys are pretty freaking tough without the right firearm, and you cannot progress in the current stage until you beat them. As for Vile Mark II, he's located in some secret area that you access via this golden teleporter hidden in every level, thus taking him on is fully optional. This is, unfortunately, where Mega Man X3 takes the piss. Only if you land your last hit on these three with a weapon they're weak against, they don't show their faces again near the end of the game. What stupid BS condition is that? I love the concept of battling entirely different bosses later in the game depending on who you've taken down beforehand, but the developers shot themselves in the foot by having it be so picky and cryptic. You may ask why I get upset over side stuff, but may I ask why Bit and Byte pop up out of nowhere to wreck my shit when I potentially don't even get the payoff for defeating them? You can say that it keeps the journey fresh and unpredictable when revisiting the game, and okay, that's a reasonable argument, but I definitely would have preferred all of this being optional and directly shaking up the endgame without some preposterous and unexplained rules attached to it. On the topic of bosses, the ones in Mega Man X3 are pretty weak. I don't mean weak as in power, because son of a bitch, some of the Mavericks hit really hard, while X2 thankfully made it so that almost, if not all of the Mavericks are manageable to beat for the average Mega Man players. X3 reverts to X1's approach, where it might as well be impossible for first-time players of the game to beat about half of the bosses as a first pick. Look, I understand that Mega Man games have always been set up as such intentionally, to make the adventures longer than they in reality are, but that doesn't mean I have to agree with it. It doesn't ruin my experience much, as I've said before, but it may very well for others. Besides this, why do I think the bosses in Mega Man X3 are weak? It's their AI. Some of them are easily caught in a loop, which is admittedly a guilty pleasure of mine, but good design it ain't. And once you have that weapon a Maverick isn't too keen on, it keeps getting stunned over and over with every hit. Many attacks can be cancelled via this method, and it's something I didn't witness nearly as frequently in the previous installments. Boss fights in Mega Man games always become fairly simple with the proper firearm, but this is ridiculous. It reaches that point where the bosses are either too hard or too easy, with the sweet spot in between one too many times missing. At least the appearances of the Mavericks are really cool though, far more intimidating and badass than in X1 and especially X2. I'm not done bitching, shamefully. It's time to address a flaw that has aggravated me ever since I picked up X1 and continue to do so in X2 and X3, but for whatever reason didn't include in my previous scripts, probably to keep the videos of a reasonable length. Not that that ever happens on this channel, so here we go nonetheless. The final bosses in the Mega Man X games are, so far, respectably tough, even with 4 sub-tanks filled. If you go in, drain a couple or all of your sub-tanks in an attempt to beat the game and then die anyway, you have to go through the soul-crushing process of refilling all these darn emptied sub-tanks. You do so by blowing up a respawning enemy and hoping it drops health. Rinse and repeat till you've got all your sub-tanks ready again. This always takes forever, and you're going to be doing it every time you die. I honestly have more fun sitting at the fucking checkout at the local supermarket. Granted, it's not a requirement, but if you couldn't win with 4 sub-tanks, then chances of you doing it with none are very slim indeed. In my opinion, all your available sub-tanks should be refilled as soon as the final fight of the game starts. Players are bound to refill them anyway, so why make it such a needless chore to do? The fact your weapon energy also isn't replenished when you die makes things even worse. You want to use the weapon the bosses are weak against, right? Adding even more pointless farming to this whole mix. And in the case of X3, having to walk up to the boss and commit suicide until you get a game over because the enemies here don't drop energy for weapons. The time spent doing all this nonsense is substantially greater than actually battling and trying to kill the final boss. There's no way you can convince me that is well thought out design. It is padding, it is obnoxious, it is disencouraging, and it plain sucks. Sheesh, that's a lot of criticisms in a row. Maybe I should get into a few positive aspects before we reach the end, such as the graphics. Occasionally, the game looks a bit dark and bleak, but I have nothing against that as long as it's not like that all the time. The environments in this game are overall appealing to the eyes. I don't necessarily get the impression they are more detailed than before, but the use of color is my favorite of the bunch yet, with deeper contrasts. And there are loads of animated assets like moving waterfalls, flowing electricity, and blinking lights. The parallax scrolling effects also have the most amount of depth here, and all of this goes a long way to livening things up and immersing me into this virtual world. There's often this great sense of progression within the levels as well. Take Toxic Seahorses stage, where you start inside like a nasty toxic sewer area of some sort, progress into an underwater area underneath the dams, and ultimately climb outside onto the dams. Mega Man X1 and X2 stages do this type of thing too, but not to the same extent. Perhaps I'm overselling the elements, but I believe X3 has its older brothers beaten by a long shot in terms of visuals, quite frankly. Best of all, I'm trying to remember some slowdown issues at the moment, but I can't think of any. I wouldn't be completely surprised if I'm mistaken, but I effortlessly recalled them from X1 and X2, so that's gotta mean something, I guess. The Saturn version, unfortunately, as ridiculous as this sounds, is absolutely horrendous with it. My original intention was to record a playthrough with this port as well, but the slowdown made it borderline unplayable. Now it makes sense that Mega Man X3 on Saturn was once called the worst game on the system. My god. Saturn jank aside, Mega Man X3's music is pretty darn sweet. X2 is a step up visually from X1, but musically most people would agree it's all around inferior. Not only is X3 better looking than X1 and even X2, its soundtrack is anything but bland and puts X2's to shame. The original game still remains king in the audio department, I'd say, but X3 doesn't fall too far behind. These songs are definitely the grittiest and heaviest so far, with the electric guitar plastered all over, something that might be off-putting to you depending on your preferences. And X3's score isn't as varied as X1's as a result. The samples also could have used some smoothing over. They tend to be a tad taserish and high-pitched, but I think the majority of the compositions and the way they are arranged fit the settings of the game exceptionally well. Hold on for a second, let's not skimp over the PS1 and Saturn music, shall we? Yeah, so because these consoles use optical media to read games, all tunes from Mega Man X3 have been updated, to the serious displeasure of a lot of fans. Instead of heavy rock arrangements, this Red Book audio version of the score contains synthy and upbeat remixes of the original tracks in typical early 90s fashion. Needless to say, the remixes form an awkward mismatch with the game's tone. The two just don't go together well, but regardless of such, I do appreciate this different take on X3's tunes. It's awesome in its own right, with higher quality instruments, more punch, a wider soundstage, and superior mixing. In-game, the SNES counterpart does the job better, but outside of that, for casual listening, I must confess I dig the PS1 and Saturn stuff more. Mega Man X3 closely follows the gameplay formula of its predecessors, but has more additions over X2 than X2 does over X1. Besides the usual heart container, sub-tank and armor upgrade items, this last installment of the X saga on the SNES also brings enhancement chips, various summonable ride armors, and the ability to play as Zero. With all that going for it, X3 is the most fleshed out so far with the most amount of depth to the gameplay. How the rest of the game holds up in comparison to the other two titles is all up to the wishes and expectations of the player in question. To me, the side quest of Bit, Byte and Vile Mark II isn't as intuitive, many bosses are once again too hard as first picks and not as fun to begin with, and the way many of the collectibles are obtained feels somewhat lame and lacking compared to before. That being said, I think Mega Man X3 is my favorite of the three. The level design, while a bit sloppy in some respects, is the most engaging with clever enemies. The weapons X has available to him here have the best balance, and I get a great kick out of how much shit there is to collect this time around. How it all affects the way the adventure progresses and plays more accurately. It makes for fantastic replay value, exceeding that of X1 and X2 by a reasonable margin, and them visuals and them soundtracks are both very solid, not just either of the two. I don't believe anybody can make an objective statement as to which 16-bit Mega Man X installment is the best. Each have their own strengths and weaknesses, and how much weight they hold to somebody heavily varies. I personally had the most amount of fun with X3, and while it's arguably not as tightly designed as its predecessors, it's by no means a bad Mega Man game or a bad game period. The SNES card is ridiculously expensive. It's for the die-hard collectors only, so my recommendation is the Wii or Wii U's Virtual Console if you want the original version. If you want the PS1 port, the Mega Man X collection on PlayStation 2 again comes highly recommended. And that was Mega Man X3, ladies and gents. You know, I noticed after the editing how sloppy the voiceover actually is in this video. I must have been out of shape or something, but I hope you enjoyed the video regardless. If you want to catch updates and sneak peeks on the stuff I do, make sure you head over to my Facebook and our Twitter page. If you've done so already, you'd know, for example, that Symphony of the Night is now really up next and is also the last review of 2015. Please look forward to that, and thank you for watching today's episode. Have yourselves a great day and take care.